Hello, Vaughn.
Hi, Harold. How are you?
Good. Well, boy, another crazy week in BC politics. A budget vote that
Yep.
could have sent us into another election.
This is the big vote of the year, which is basically the legislature approving the budget and then saying now we move on to debating the budget in detail, ministry by ministry. So it's the key vote, and if that fails, that's it. The the House has effectively said we don't approve your ability to spend money. And that's as fatal as it gets for governments. So if they'd lost that vote, that would be it. And, the way the last election came down, it's close. I was in the House to watch, and it was 46 votes to 46 votes. So the Greens and the Independents and the Conservatives all voted no on the budget. And the 46 New Democrats all voted yes. That's a tie. And when there's a tie, the Speaker of the Legislature, Raj Chauhan, who's a New Democrat, he's allowed to break the tie. And in general, the Speaker votes to keep things going. The Speaker is not going to vote to bring down his own government. So it passed by one vote. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last few years, Harold, is that members are now allowed to vote from home. They're allowed to
Mm.
debate from home and vote from home. So you had a half dozen members cast their votes from home. You've got one member on the government side with serious health problems who's having to be home, I think, in fragile health. And you've got one member on the opposition side who had a stroke over the winter and who is also working from home. There's others work from home for other reasons, family and so forth. But anyway, it's interesting. It's always one of the little suspense issues is will the members make sure that they have the right background behind them? You're supposed to be in your home office, not on the beach in Cancun. And they have to be sure they know how to turn the mic on and operate the voting mechanism. So, anyway, all of that happened. It was just before noon on Thursday, and the government survived, and on we go. So, we've had speculation that they could lose a vote if some member is incapacitated and can't vote. We've had speculation that, well, one of their own members is not going to desert them. I'll say this for the NDP: they're disciplined, and they also know the stakes. If they bring down their own government or don't even show for a vote, we could be into an election. And right now, I don't know as though they'd win re-election. I don't think that budget of theirs, Harold, is much of a thing to take to voters. What I've mostly heard is criticism of the budget from all directions.
Well, I guess we could also thank TELUS or Bell or whatever service providers these people have at home that their internet allowed them to vote.
Yeah. No, I mean, you remember last year we had one called Blurgate, right? So the rules say that the member must be in the home office, right? So it's got to be showing behind you. But you had a member last year, member of the government, Rick Glumac, whose background was blurred. And the opposition said, we don't know where the hell he is. How do we know he was in his home office? He could have been anywhere. And they tried to get the vote disallowed. The speaker allowed the vote, but the members have been told you're going to have to be sure you follow the rules. The New Democrats also had one occasion last year where they provided a staffer to show a member who was having trouble with the mechanism and getting online to get it. So it's close.
It's close.
It
Oh
would
dear.
take now that there has been a ruling over the years, and we should say this: the previous clerk of the legislature, who was a senior clerk in the whole British Commonwealth of Nations, George McMahon, he'd made it clear that a government can't be defeated by accident. The government isn't going to fall because we had Glenn Clark miss a vote as premier because he showed up too late and the door was locked in the chamber, and we've had other misunderstandings and accidents. If it's just an accident, if it's just a screw up, there's parliamentary precedent to recall the vote the next day and do
I
it
see.
again. So, and that's the way it should be. I don't
Yes.
think you should have the government falling and sending us into an election because some member can't figure out how to switch on the home voting device. So, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Anyway,
Is there any provision, you mentioned that a couple one on each side is has health issues. Is there any provision if one were be unable to vote for health issues that the other side would step down one vote or
uh, that's called pairing. And
yes.
we used to have pairing in the BC House. So a cabinet minister who was going to go make a speech in the north would pair with a member of the opposition who wouldn't show up and wouldn't vote. That whole system broke down here in the bitter politics of the 1970s, and we've
Hmm,
never really had it since then.
I
So,
see.
in theory, yes, but we've never really had it, and I don't know whether a government in this precarious position would even trust the opposition to
Hmm,
keep the agreement. So
right.
no, I mean it really is, but. The minister, the House leader, Mike Farnworth, got up in the House and said all the other budget bills are confidence measures too because they all involve money and spending, so there are other votes during the session. The government can also do what it did last year, and they declared some legislation as confidence just to keep their own troops in line and make sure they showed up for the vote. So they survived what, 6 or 7 confidence votes last year, including 3 of them where the speaker broke the tie. So they've got the votes to go on, but I guess you sort of go, how long are they going to go and live with a one vote majority that's this precarious? Well, I guess the answer to that is they do they really want to go to the voters with a budget that is being denounced for its deficits, for its tax increases, 4 billion worth of them, and this is perverse, its spending cuts because there are also, even though they increase spending in some areas, they cut it and capped it in others. So you're hearing a lot of complaints about $10 a day childcare, about the big change that affects seniors who've been deferring their property taxes, discouraged from doing that, reductions in long-term care. Universities and colleges are complaining that their funding has been capped at a time when international student enrollment is down. So there's lots of complaints out there on all 3 areas, revenue, spending, and deficits. And again, it's hard to me to imagine that a group of politicians would deliberately choose to take a vote like that to the electorate. And it's only been 18 months since the last election. So,
Right.
you
Right.
need a pretty good reason to go to another election.
Yeah. Oh, what does that say on your mug? You have to tell us.
It's Christy Clark, and it says, I gave Christy Clark $20,000, and all I got was this lousy mug. Needless to say, the New Democrats put that out in the 2017 election, where Clark was in trouble for the amount of cash she was raising. Those big cash days are gone from BC politics, as you know. I should have got my Mr. Spock Star Trek mug up because I've got one of those too, and
Right. Well,
it changes color when there's warm coffee in it.
well, I guess in BC we can't think of Star Trek without thinking of former Premier John Horgan,
John,
and
I know.
this
Yeah,
government undid one of his, one of the things that people gave him credit for, the
yeah.
introduction of a way to scrutinize firings in the public service. That goes back to a very, very serious issue in the
Yeah,
government dealt
a
with.
long time ago now, but
Yes.
still, I mean, issues never go away in British Columbia, is my theory. But in 2012, the health ministry suddenly, on the spot, fired a half dozen researchers in healthcare and cut off the contract for another and ruined their lives, right? These were all respected researchers, people who made their living in it. They were branded with sort of bogus, turned out fraud allegations, and one of them killed himself. So it's an awful case. People that I know that know the BC Public Service say it's the worst HR disaster in the BC Public Service in its entire history. So it blew up. It went badly sideways. They ended up sending the whole issue of what went wrong to the ombudsman. And the ombudsperson came back with a report with a whole bunch of recommendations. And that report came out on the eve of the election in 2017. And the New Democrats, of course, made an issue of it. And of course, it was a factor in Christy Clark losing her majority. I mean, she lost her majority by 200 votes and 1 seat. So there were a lot of issues, but that was one of the bad ones for her because she had a lot of trouble in that campaign with what happened. So Horgan comes in and he takes this ombudsman's report and all the recommendations and he says we're going to implement them. One of the recommendations was that dismissals were being handled badly in the public service and you needed independent scrutiny. Well, the ombudsman noted we already had a merit commissioner, an independent officer, who handled hiring and promotion in the public service. The ombudsman said the solution is obvious. Give it to the merit commissioner to review firings as well. And John Horgan brought in legislation to do just that. Carol James got up in the legislature, introduced the bill in 2018 and said, we should never forget this. This legislation will help make sure this never happens again, that public servants are fired without fair due process. And there can always be legal action and appeals, but she said this will allow the independent merit commissioner to step in and scrutinize that. And the commissioner's been doing that ever since. And a few years ago, a legislature committee looked at it, says working very well, leave it the way it is. Well, in the budget this year, they've abolished, the New Democrats have done, they've abolished the merit commissioner, which means that the reform that John Horgan brought in is abolished along with it. There will no longer be any independent scrutiny of hirings or promotions or firing in the public service. And, you hear the finance minister, Harold Benda Bailey, defending this, and she says, oh, well, the public service can handle this stuff in-house. And you're going, the whole point of what went wrong there is that they couldn't and they didn't, and it was a travesty. And the reason John Horgan brought in legislation to fix it was so there would be an independent check on what was going on. Like, I don't get the logic of what they're doing here at all. They're undoing one of the good reforms that John Horgan brought in. And it was not like it was a long time ago. The bill was brought in 2018, and it's worked very well ever since.
The other issue, again, the province this government wouldn't want to campaign on, relates to private property rights and the Cowichan decision and other decisions. Where are we at with that? Do we have an appeal yet?
Okay, so we got three things happening. The government has said it is going to, the government has appealed one of the decisions that came out last year. So the decision that set aside the province's mineral claims legislation because it was incompatible with the UN declarations. The government is seeking leave from the Supreme Court of Canada. That was a BC Court of Appeal decision. Government is seeking leave from the Supreme Court of Canada to appeal that. We haven't heard yet whether the High Court will take the appeal. Second thing that's happened is the government's hired a former deputy minister, Doug Cale, and he is taking around to the province's Indigenous leaders the proposed changes that the government wants to make in the UN declaration legislation. So shopping those around, we've heard initially some of the Indigenous leaders who've seen this, they have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But they've made pretty clear they don't like it. They don't support any changes in that legislation. The third thing we're waiting for is the Cowichan decision. So that's the case where a BC Supreme Court justice awarded Aboriginal title over public and private land in Richmond. One of the private landowners has gone to court, Montrose Properties, and is seeking to reopen the case because Montrose Properties says they weren't given a chance. They weren't even told their land was on the table. They weren't given a chance. And that decision has been, that repeal has been made to the judge who made the case. She reserved decision. We haven't heard back from her yet. When that's over, then the province is going to appeal the entire decision, and that will go to the BC Court of Appeal. They say the holdup is they want the decision on reopening the case resolved first. We've heard they are going to file sometime this spring. They haven't done so yet. So there's a whole lot of pieces in motion on this. And I would say that's another reason why I think the government would be reluctant to go to an election, because there's so many questions now in the public realm about private property and Indigenous rights and the UN Declaration. I don't think you'd want to go into a campaign with a whole bunch of those issues out there in the form of questions, because I think the opposition would make pretty good use of that in a campaign.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Vaughn. Look forward
Talk
to
to you
chatting
next
again
week.
next week.
Yeah.